I really feel that I feel very privileged to now request Dr. Karan Singh to come and give his inaugural address. उनके बारे में कुछ बोलना ही बेकार है और मैं एक मिनट भी और बर्बाद किए बिना उनको बुलाती हूँ क्योंकि उनको सुनना हमारे लिए बहुत बड़ी उपलब्धि होगी, हमारा अचीवमेंट होगा आज का.
Some very interesting and thought-provoking remarks. Srimati Saroj Bala, who is persistent and irresistible. So although I showed extreme reluctance to speak at such a technical gathering, she more or less insisted that I come, and which I could not ultimately decline. Shri Ashok Bhatnagar, who is seated on the dais, Sangeeta Gupta, and distinguished friends and delegates to this very interesting international conference. There is no doubt that Indian culture is very ancient and it deals with a whole spectrum of fascinating areas. The Vedic culture, for example, the post-Vedic, it's not only philosophy. The philosophy is best known thanks to the Upanishads, basically. It is in the Upanishads that the wisdom and the glory of the Vedas are really expressed. But whether it is grammar or aesthetics or medicine or metallurgy or astronomy or psychology or economics or politics, you name it, there is a great deal of material in our cultural heritage on almost every subject that you can think of. And unfortunately, that has not been adequately reflected in our educational system. The reason being, as Dr. Kapoor has said, that a lot of the claims that we make are dismissed as being hyperbolic or being imaginary or being without any solid scientific proof. Now there are two different ways in which this whole matter can be approached. One is to accept everything that the Western scholars have written, and they have written very well. I must pay my tribute here to the scholars, people like Sir William Jones, who founded the Asiatic Society, James Prinsep, Alexander Hamilton, Max Muller. These were people, also John Marshall, who did the excavations on Mohenjo-daro. All these people, they were British people, but they really worked hard in India. They gave their lives almost in trying to unearth our inscriptions. If Prinsep had not unearthed that inscription of Ashoka, we would still have been in the dark with regard to that whole glorious period of our history. So let us not trash what Western historians or Western scholars have said. So one way is to accept everything they say. The other way is to trash everything they say. नहीं नहीं ये तो सारा गलत है. एटम बॉम्ब हमारे पास ब्रह्मास्त्र था, जेट प्लेन्स हमारे पास उड़न खटोला था, ये है हमारे पास सुश्रुता था. In other words, a sort of revanchist attitude where we try and point out, no, we already had everything under the earth and these were only sort of subsequent discoveries. My submission is that what we need is a creative symbiosis between these two structures. We need definitely to look into what the Western authors have written on a whole variety of subjects, and we also need to try and get to the root of our own culture and its historic background. Several mysteries remain unresolved. The whole Indus-Saraswati Valley civilization is a fascinating question. How did it come about? Why did it disappear? Now with aerial photography, one can you can get much more information. Satellite technology, you can get much more information about how this great river, which is so extolled in the Vedas, disappeared. So there are various theories, I'm not going into it. And what about the civilization that flourished on the banks of rivers? Because all great civilizations in human history have begun on the banks of great rivers, whether it is the Nile or the Euphrates or the Ganga or the Saraswati. And that whole civilization there, the the extraordinary excavations in Mohenjo-daro, and those huge baths, I mean, there's something absolutely mind-boggling. What sort of a civilization must it have been that supported such huge baths and such beautiful ports? So they all need to be looked into, as well as the chronology of these various events. Now, your institution has undertaken a most fascinating project. I must congratulate you on that. And that is to date Vedic and epic events through astronomical calculations. It's like carbon dating. It's a sort of astronomical correlate of carbon dating. Carbon dating can tell you immediately by a certain process how old that object is. Now, what you have done, as far as I understand, is you've tried to look through the Vedas and particularly the Puranas and the epics to see what constellation of stars and planets were described. And then once you had fixed those, then working backward through your computers, you try to find out when that could have happened. Because the exact constellations would not recur for I don't know, 100,000 years or whatever. So this is a unique and fascinating way of trying to map the timeline, as it were, of our events. And I looked through this first volume, Historicity of Vedic and Ramayana eras. I find it very, very fascinating because it seems to cover, not only does it cover the historical events, but it covers a whole lot of areas like plants and political structures and human settlements and arts and crafts and genealogy of rulers and what science and technology existed then. So we have certainly no need to be in any way defensive about our civilization, and we've created such extraordinary things. Even 1,000 years ago, the Brihadeshwara temple was built in Tanjavur and Angkor Wat was built in Siem Reap in Cambodia. 1,000 years ago. I don't think we can build that today with all our technology and all our computers. I don't think we can build a Brihadeshwara temple. So the capacity to create the tremendous pluralistic diversity of our culture, the basic philosophical concept that there are multiple paths to the truth, that is extremely important. We are a dialogic civilization, remember that. We are not a revelatory civilization. In a revelatory civilization, there is a revelation and you either take it or you leave it. But in a dialogic civilization, you can keep asking questions. The Upanishads, for example, are a series of very sharp dialogues between students and pupils, asking fundamental and difficult questions. The whole of the Gita is a dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna. So the fact that we are a dialogic civilization means that we can continue to ask questions and we do not have to be afraid of any consequences for doing that. And therefore these questions revolve around that Rigvedic dictum, Ekam Sat Vipraha Bahudha Vadanti. The truth is one, the wise call it by many names. So until we accept multiple paths to the divine, there will never be peace on earth. And the same is true with multiple paths to science. Science has changed. I remember when I was growing up, it was still the Cartesian dichotomy dominated the world of science. But even in our own lifetimes, we've seen these revolutions, the Einsteinian revolution, the Heisenbergian revolution, the quantum mechanics appearing as if out of nowhere, and all the astounding and totally unimaginable events and developments that have taken place. The latest cover of Time magazine has a marvelous thing called the Eternity Machine. He says it's a machine which costs $10 billion. It is made up of I don't know how many million parts, and nobody knows how it works. So, it's one of those extraordinary efforts to get into the structure of matter. We now realize that the old concept of Ishavasyamidam Sarvam Yatkin Jagatyam Jagat that we had in our Upanishads, that this entire cosmos, not only the speck of dust that we call planet Earth, but the billions upon billions of galaxies in the illimitable universe around us are all illuminated by, inhabited by the same divine force. So therefore, if it was an explosion of light, if it was an explosion of energy, it was also an explosion of consciousness. And that is why through the millennia we have evolved to where we are today and how we can evolve in the future. So there are some I think that some of our philosophical concepts also have got to be integrated. I don't think that the scientific concepts are separate and the philosophical concepts are separate. In fact, the philosophical concepts underpin much of our scientific analysis, and they are the sort of underpinning and foundation of what we are trying to do. I think that we must accept good thoughts from wherever they come, ahano bhadra kirtavo yantu vishwataha, and make them our own. This whole question about the Aryans, whether they came or whether they didn't come and all, still an open question. I'm not going to go into that. But I think it doesn't really matter. For example, now the Upanishads, quite frankly, the date of the Upanishads doesn't excite me. It makes no difference to me whether they were 1500 years old or 2500 years old. It's the ideas that are important. If we miss the ideas and only get involved in historicity, that is a thing you must be careful about, because in the West they're spending all their time on the historicity of Christ. Where was he born? What is the proof? What is the proof? What is the proof? Fair enough, do that. But do not let your obsession with historicity dilute your awareness of the deeper aspects of our culture. That is the only point that I would really like to put before this distinguished audience, because you are all panelists and you are all distinguished scientists. You must have your own approach to these various problems. But I think it's tremendously important to keep in mind the basic philosophical concepts and then to see how we can find out without any doubt the age. And I agree with you that this dismissal of Indian civilization is not acceptable. What the link was between the Mohenjo-daro, Harappa and the later civilization is still an open question. I think some people like you were trying to prove that it was a continuum, that in fact one flowed from the other. That is still, mind you, an open question. The jury is still out on that. You have to do much more work to prove that. How did it go? How did these huge open cities and open baths suddenly disappear and develop into the other kinds of cities, fortified cities? What were the conflicts? What were the conflicts between the Aryans and the Dasyus? Were they between various tribes that lived here before and the people who came? Some people are now saying there's no such thing as an Aryan thing at all. Everybody is, genetically of course we are all the same. I think we all come from some black lady in Africa, don't we, how many billion years ago. So there's no big deal in that. But the thing is that how does that link? For example, in the Vedas, there are constant references to the wars. There are prayers to the gods, give us power to withstand the enemy, give us power to defeat the enemy, and so on. Now, who was the enemy? You can't just write that, blithely brush that aside. Who was the enemy? Who were they fighting in the Vedas? Were they the Adivasis? Were they the indigenous tribes? Were they the remnants of the Mohenjo-daro civilization? Where were they? What were they? How did they work? A lot of novels are now being written, by the way. You may have read that, The Immortals of Meluha. There's a very bright young Punjabi, Amish Sharma, Amish Tripathi or Sharma or something. And only a Brahmin could think that up. He's written some very fascinating. His first book was very good, second was not so good, third one was bad. But that's neither here nor that's my own personal view. But it is the fascinating idea that you could recreate, as it were, in your mind what that civilization was like. I've always been fascinated. The Indus Valley script, despite all your claims and anybody's claims, has still not been fully deciphered. I gave 2 Jawaharlal Nehru fellowships for deciphering the Indus Valley scripts many years ago. There are many attempts have been made, many books have been published, but so far there is no universally recognized script. Working out the script, understanding the script. Unless you get a Rosetta Stone, which has two different scripts at the same time, you're not going to get it. Now, how is it such a great civilization and we cannot read, you cannot read the script? There are certain fascinating attempts here, and some people say, no, all these animals that were there are also found in the Vedas. I don't know, I don't want to go into that controversy. I simply want to say that there are still a lot of unanswered questions. And I congratulate you and Saroj Bala and Dr. Kapoor and people like him for really making a serious effort through scientific mechanisms to date various events. As I said, this is a correlate of the carbon dating system. It's a very ingenious idea. I don't know who thought it up, but it is an extraordinary idea to say, okay, what were the stars like at that time? I didn't realize until I read this book that there is so much information in the epics and in the Vedas about where the nakshatras were placed, or where the stars, where the planets were placed. A star is an individual, a nakshatra is a group of stars, and a planet, of course, is a planet. So how were they all placed? What was their correlation? And if you can get that and work your computer and see, okay, what time was that? That might be an absolutely fascinating exercise. So good luck to all of you in the work that you're doing. Keep doing it in this spirit. As Dr. Kapil Kapoor said, the true Indian spirit of inquiry, which is not rigorous, which is not unitarian, which is not authoritarian, but which on the other word is dialogic, which is open, which is receptive, which is resilient, and yet which is powerful and is able to make its point without any prevarication. That I would feel would be the philosophy of this organization. I look forward to, even today you have a whole group of very interesting topics and experts in each panel. Effective endeavors for unification of India since Vedic times. I suppose that goes all the way up to our constitution, which is an effective endeavor to unify what was left of India. But whatever, these political science things are also mingled in this. What were the Janapadas? How were they functioning? What were the modes and structures of society? And one point which is often uncomfortable, but which has to be addressed. How is it that the greatest philosophy in the world, the Vedanta, was supported by an extremely cruel and iniquitous caste system? In the same way as the greatest Western philosophy, the Greeks, was underwritten by slavery. Let's face it, slavery was there along with Plato. And let's face it, the caste system was there along with the Yajnavalkya. And then how were the divisions made? I know the theories of how they came, but why all this oppression? Why is there so much cruelty? Why was there not a more egalitarian attitude in our history? So therefore, while we are very proud of much of our history, we are not proud of all of our history. Let me make that point. I'm not proud of the fact that untouchability flourished for thousands and thousands of years, or that people were looked upon as untouchables, couldn't even enter temples, and some of them were not even supposed to be seen. And what sort of, on the one hand, the Upanishads say, Ishvara sarva bhutanam hrideshe tishtati. The Lord resides in the heart of all beings. When Shankaracharya came out of the Vishwanath temple, there was a Chandala there with 4 dogs. And Chandala, as you know, is a Dalit. And the Chandala said, Shankaracharya said, move away. He said, who are you to say move away? If it is the body, then your body is as good as mine. If it is the Atman, then your Atma is as good as mine. How can you tell me to move away? And then he disappeared, and Shankaracharya realized it was Lord Shiva himself who had come in the form of a Chandala. And then he made a beautiful 5 verses of stotras. Now if Lord Shiva, who's the greatest Lord, I'll talk about Shiva some other time, because there's something fascinating. Can I talk? Have I got time? Yes. Book wale ruk rahe hai mere liye. I want to rush. No, I just want to say something about Shiva. Shiva is different from, let's say, Shiva and Vishnu. I'm not making a value judgment. Shiva lives on the earth. Vishnu lives in Vaikuntha. And therefore, even people, even the oppressed, the outcast,